My grandmother once showed me her most treasured family photograph. It was taken in 1889, featuring her great-great-grandmother surrounded by her 3 children. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the sepia-toned image. I nodded, studying the formal poses, the elaborate Victorian clothing, the serious expressions. Then my grandmother added, almost casually, "Of course, little Margaret there, the one in the white dress. She was already dead when they took this." I nearly dropped my coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" "Dead. 3 days, I think. They posed her between her siblings. See how they're holding her up? And look at her eyes. They painted pupils on the photograph afterward." I stared at the image with new horror. What I had assumed was just Victorian stiffness was actually, quite literally, the stiffness of death. That's the most disturbing family bonding activity I've ever heard of," I finally managed. "What's next? Weekend corpse picnics?" My grandmother laughed at my discomfort. "Oh, honey, that was normal back then. Everyone did it. In fact, for many families, this was the only photograph they could afford to take." She paused, seeing my expression. "Actually, the corpse picnic thing isn't that far off. Sometimes they'd photograph the whole family at the gravesite too." That conversation sent me down a rabbit hole that lasted months. What I discovered was both more disturbing and more beautiful than I could have imagined. A window into a world where death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, where grief was public and elaborate, and where the line between life and death was captured on film in ways that seem unthinkable today. To understand Victorian post-mortem photography, you first need to understand 2 things: death in the 19th century and photography in the 19th century. Both were very different from what we know today. Let's start with death. In the Victorian era, death was everywhere. Childhood mortality rates were staggering. In the 1840s, nearly half of all children didn't survive to age 5. Women died in childbirth with frightening regularity. Diseases we consider minor today, scarlet fever, diphtheria, influenza, were often death sentences. Tuberculosis alone killed 1 in 7 people. If you lived in an industrial city, the air itself could kill you. Death wasn't something that happened in hospitals, attended by professionals. It happened at home, in the family bed, surrounded by relatives. Everyone participated in death, preparing the body, building the coffin, organising the wake. Children grew up seeing death as a natural, if painful, part of life. Now add photography to this picture. The daguerreotype process, invented in 1839, made photography possible for the first time in human history. But in those early decades, photography was expensive, time-consuming, and technically challenging. The exposure times were long, sometimes several minutes, requiring subjects to remain absolutely still. Many families couldn't afford even a single photograph during a person's lifetime. But when someone died, that was different. That was important. That was worth the expense. Think about it from a Victorian perspective. Your child has died. There is no video of them laughing. There are no snapshots from birthday parties. There's maybe a lock of hair, some clothing, perhaps a drawing if you were wealthy. But soon, very soon, you won't be able to remember exactly what their face looked like, the precise curve of their cheek, the specific shade of their hair, the exact shape of their features. All of this will fade from memory, unless you take a photograph. Thus was born the tradition of post-mortem photography, and it was far more common than most people today realise. From the 1840s through the early 1900s, these photographs were a standard part of mourning rituals across Europe and America. They weren't considered morbid or disturbing. They were considered precious, beautiful, and absolutely necessary. Here's where it gets interesting, and disturbing depending on your perspective. The Victorians didn't just photograph their dead lying in coffins, though they did that too. They went to elaborate lengths to make the deceased appear alive, or at least at peaceful rest. The earliest post-mortem photographs, from the 1840s and 1850s, tended to be simple. The deceased lying in bed or in a coffin, surrounded by flowers, clearly dead. But as photography became more sophisticated and more photographers entered the market, competition drove innovation. Photographers began offering increasingly elaborate staging options. The eternal sleep pose was popular, the deceased arranged as though peacefully sleeping, often in a chair or on a couch, sometimes with a book in their lap or a toy in their hands. The goal was to create a peaceful final image, death sanitized into slumber. But some families wanted more than sleep. They wanted a final portrait where their loved one appeared alive, and photographers obliged. Stands and braces, similar to those used to keep living subjects still during long exposures, were repurposed to hold corpses upright. The deceased would be dressed in their best clothes, positioned in a chair or even standing, with family members arranged around them as though posing for an ordinary family portrait. Eyes were particularly challenging. Sometimes photographers would prop the deceased's eyes open, though this often resulted in an unsettling, glassy stare. More commonly, they'd paint pupils onto the photograph after development, creating the illusion of open, living eyes. Some photographers became renowned for their skill at this particular detail. The results were often convincing, at least in the photograph itself. In my grandmother's family portrait, if she hadn't told me which child was dead, I might never have known. The painted eyes, the careful positioning, the siblings' hands gently supporting their sister. It all looked like a standard Victorian family photograph, until you knew what to look for. Victorian post-mortem photographs are filled with symbolism, a visual language of death and mourning that was clearly understood at the time, but has been largely forgotten today. Learning to read this language transforms these images from merely disturbing curiosities into profound documents of grief and love. The white dress. Children, particularly girls, were often photographed in white dresses, regardless of what they might have worn in life. White symbolized purity and innocence. It was also the color associated with angels, suggesting the Victorian belief that deceased children became angels in heaven. The elaborate white christening gowns were particularly popular for infant post-mortem photographs, sometimes the same gown used for the child's baptism just weeks or months earlier. Flowers. Every flower meant something specific in Victorian times, and the flowers in post-mortem photographs were carefully chosen. White lilies represented the restoration of innocence after death. Roses could mean several things depending on colour. White for purity, red for mourning. Forget-me-nots had an obvious meaning. Ivy represented eternal life and faithfulness. Families would often pose the deceased holding specific flowers or surrounded by arrangements that spelled out an entire emotional message in the language of flowers. Mirrors and covered objects. Sometimes you'll notice mirrors draped with cloth in the background of post-mortem photographs, or clocks that have been stopped. This reflected old superstitions. Mirrors were believed to trap souls, and having an uncovered mirror in the room with a corpse might prevent the soul from leaving. Stopping clocks at the moment of death was meant to honour the exact time when someone passed from life to death. Toys and possessions. Children were often photographed with their favourite toys. These weren't randomly chosen props, they were the actual beloved objects the child played with in life. A doll, a toy horse, a small drum. These items served as connection points between the child's life and their death, showing what brought them joy and marking them as individuals, not just small bodies in white dresses. Open eyes versus closed eyes. When eyes were painted open on a photograph, this often indicated a desire to remember the person as they were in life, awake, aware, present. Closed eyes suggested peaceful rest and acceptance of death. Some photographs show a deliberate mixing, the deceased with closed eyes, surrounded by family members with open eyes, emphasizing the transition from life to death. Positioning of hands. Hands folded in prayer suggested religious faith and the hope of heavenly reunion. Hands holding flowers might indicate the flowers mentioned above with their specific meanings. A mother's hand on a dead child's shoulder, a sibling's hand clasping their deceased brother's hand. These touches weren't just practical posing choices, they were declarations of enduring love and connection beyond death. The family configuration. Who appears in the photograph with the deceased tells its own story. Entire families gathered around a dead child showed the communal nature of grief. A mother alone with a deceased infant suggested the particularly intimate grief of maternal loss. Sometimes deceased family members would be photographed together. Multiple family members who died at different times would appear in a single composite image, creating a portrait of the family together in death. The photographers who specialized in post-mortem work developed remarkable technical skills. This wasn't just pointing a camera and pressing a button. It was elaborate theatrical staging combined with cutting-edge photographic techniques. Consider the challenges. A corpse doesn't pose itself. Rigor mortis sets in within hours and can make positioning difficult. Bodies cool rapidly. Skin tone changes. And all of this has to be managed while creating an image that families will treasure forever. Photographers who advertised post-mortem services, and many did quite openly, would often come to the home within hours of death, while the body was still manageable. They'd bring their equipment, heavy cameras, glass plates, chemical solutions, along with props and posing equipment. The posing stands were ingenious devices, heavy metal bases with adjustable rods and clamps that could be hidden behind the deceased's back or beneath their clothing. These stands would support the body in a seated or standing position during the long exposure time required for early photographs. Family members positioned around the deceased often served a dual purpose, both appearing in the portrait and helping to stabilize and support their dead relative. Makeup was applied liberally. The deceased's face would be powdered to reduce the waxy pallor of death. Rouge might be applied to cheeks to suggest a blush of life. If the mouth had fallen open, common in death, it would be carefully closed and sometimes held shut with hidden pins or thread. The most skilled photographers developed techniques for dealing with decomposition. If a photograph was delayed by several days, perhaps waiting for distant relatives to arrive, the photographer might use chemicals to preserve the face, stuff the cheeks with cotton to maintain their shape, or use other embalming techniques. Then came the exposure itself. Unlike living subjects who could be told to hold still, the dead were perfectly still, ironically making them ideal photographic subjects in an era of long exposures. But the living family members posed with them had to remain frozen for anywhere from several seconds to several minutes, depending on the lighting and the photographic technology available. Imagine holding your dead child in your arms, maintaining a serene expression, absolutely motionless, while the camera captures this terrible moment. The emotional discipline required is staggering. After the photograph was developed, the real artistry often began. Photographers would hand tint the images, adding colour to cheeks, lips and clothing. They'd paint in eyes if the family requested it. They'd sometimes add jewellery or other details that hadn't photographed well. Some photographers would composite multiple images together, allowing deceased family members who died years apart to appear together in a single portrait. The best post-mortem photographers were celebrities in their communities, their skills sought after and highly paid. This wasn't seen as a morbid profession, but as a valuable service, an art form that preserved memory and honoured the dead. If you look at collections of Victorian post-mortem photographs today, you'll notice something heartbreaking. The overwhelming majority of subjects are children. This reflects the brutal reality of Victorian mortality rates. Parents expected to outlive some of their children. It was common for families to lose multiple children to disease, accident, or the simple dangers of 19th century life. The photographs of deceased children follow certain patterns. Babies and very young children were often photographed in their cribs, surrounded by white fabric that resembled clouds, creating a baby in heaven aesthetic. They might be holding a cross or flowers. The photographs often included the actual baptismal gown or christening dress, emphasizing the child's innocence and salvation. Older children might be photographed in elaborate staged scenes. A dead daughter might be posed at a piano, her favorite instrument. A son might be positioned with his toy soldiers or books. These photographs attempted to capture not just what the child looked like, but who they were, their interests, their personality, their place in the family. One particularly poignant tradition was photographing deceased children with their living siblings. The living children would pose normally, but the deceased child would be positioned between them, often with the siblings' hands on their dead brother or sister's shoulders or holding their hands. These images emphasized family bonds that transcended death. They also served a practical purpose. They created a document showing the entire family together, something that might not have been photographed while everyone was alive. Some of these photographs show remarkable staging. A dead child might be positioned in a chair at the family table, with the rest of the family seated as though at a meal together, or posed in bed with living siblings lying next to them. The message was clear. Death has separated us physically, but this child is still part of our family, still loved, still remembered. The emotional weight of these images is almost unbearable from a modern perspective. We see a mother holding her dead infant, the baby's head lolling against her shoulder, and we can barely comprehend posing for such a photograph. But for these Victorian mothers, this wasn't morbid. It was their one chance to have a photograph with their child. For many families, the post-mortem photograph would be the only photograph of their child they would ever possess. The backgrounds and settings of post-mortem photographs are as symbolic as the flowers and clothing. Photographers and families carefully chose environments that communicated specific messages about death, memory, and the afterlife. The deathbed scene. The most common and straightforward setting was the deathbed itself. The deceased would be photographed lying in the bed where they died, surrounded by family members. This emphasized the home death, the idea that dying at home, surrounded by loved ones, was the good death that Victorians aspired to. These photographs often showed incredible intimacy. Parents lying next to deceased children, siblings gathered on the bed, grandparents holding deceased grandchildren. The bed became a stage for displaying the family's grief and their enduring bonds. The garden, or natural setting. Some families requested outdoor post-mortem photographs, with the deceased positioned in gardens or under trees. This symbolized the connection between death and nature, the idea of returning to the earth. Flowers blooming around a dead child suggested resurrection and renewal. Trees represented both the family tree and the tree of life. These outdoor settings were more common in spring and summer, when the symbolism of natural renewal was most powerful. The Victorian parlour. For more formal post-mortem portraits, the deceased might be photographed in the family's best room, the parlour. This was where families received important guests, and the deceased was being honoured as the most important presence in the home. The parlour setting also allowed for elaborate staging, with furniture, curtains, and decorative objects that signalled the family's social status, even in death. Churches and religious settings. Some post-mortem photographs were taken in churches or with heavy religious symbolism in the background, crosses, Bibles, religious paintings. This emphasized faith, the promise of resurrection, and the belief that death was merely a transition to eternal life. These photographs were particularly common in Catholic communities, where elaborate death rituals were part of the culture. The coffin setting. As we move into the later Victorian period and early 1900s, there was a shift toward photographing the deceased in their coffins. These photographs were more openly about death, less about pretending the person was sleeping or alive. The deceased would be photographed in an elaborate coffin, often surrounded by massive flower arrangements, with family members standing around the coffin or viewing it. These images acknowledged death more directly, while still emphasizing the beauty and importance of the funeral ritual. An interesting shift occurred in post-mortem photography as camera technology improved and photography became more affordable. In the 1840s and 1850s, when photographs were expensive, post-mortem images often tried to make the deceased appear alive. This might be the family's only portrait of the person, so they wanted them to look living. But by the 1870s and 1880s, as photography became more common and many families could afford occasional portraits during life, post-mortem photography evolved. There was less pretense about the person being alive. Photographs became more obviously memorial in nature, showing the deceased clearly at rest, often in coffins, clearly dead, but peacefully so. This shift also reflected changing attitudes toward death. The early Victorian period was characterized by what historians call romantic death. Death was sentimentalized, beautified, softened. The later Victorian period saw a gradual movement toward more realistic, less sentimental approaches to mortality. By the 1890s and early 1900s, you start seeing post-mortem photographs that would be more recognizable to modern viewers. Formal funeral photographs, pictures of flower arrangements and tombstones, photographs of the gravesite. The intimate home death scene was giving way to the modern funeral industry. Victorian post-mortem photographs weren't just about preserving a visual memory. They were communication devices, sending specific messages to both the living and, some believed, the dead.